Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of No More Silos. My name is Erica and this is my podcast. I am super excited that you have decided to join me again today on No More Silos, where we are talking about all things cultural Christianity and history and the Bible. And it's kind of a Bible study, not always a Bible study. Sometimes it's more of a historical commentary. But Today, I realized that every year I learned something new, and I hope you do too, as a lifelong learner. And that's a big part of why I do this podcast, because as I learn stuff, I just really want to share it with you guys. And so thank you so much for all of you who have continued to support this podcast and support me through Patreon or your prayers. I just really appreciate it. And by the way, if you have not visited No More Silos on Patreon, I've been posting a little bit more frequently in the last 6 months with blog posts, extra Bible studies. There's some video studies. There's links to resources that we've put out there for you, and I hope that you find those resources worthy of your time. So I learned something new every year, and this year I learned something new about Elizabeth. Who's Elizabeth? Elizabeth is John the Baptist's mother. Now, there's other Elizabeths, I think, in the Bible too, but to clarify, we're talking about the mother of John the Baptist. Let me read to you what did not click with me until recently, because I was asked to fill in for my husband one Sunday recently, and it was one of those things where it was too last minute to ask anybody else on the pastoral team to put something together, because I'm always working on things for the podcast. I did have something to go on, and it fit with the current sermon series, so that was good. But here's the thing, and this is our, I guess, Christmas episode for the year. And if you have not listened to the Christmas episodes on No More Silos before, I do encourage you to scroll back through the episodes and look for those. I will try to put links to them in the show notes when I'm done. However, last year we talked about the nativity and how, if you're reconstructing your faith and deconstructing your faith, one of the stumbling blocks in the holiday season, because thank you, Internet, and now thank you, ChatGPT, there's a lot of information out there. And those nativity scenes that you see all over the place at your grandma's house, or my mom had a really pretty one, they're not actually accurate to what happened. And they're not even accurate to what's in the Bible. So check out the previous No More Silos episode on the Christmas story. I think I focused in that one on the Magi. But this time I noticed something new in the book of Luke, in Luke's gospel. And the way that I framed it is, or actually the way it is framed, I can't even say that, I can't even take credit for this. When Luke is a physician who's following the disciples around, following Jesus around, and he's kind of taken notes. And it's a good thing he does, because at some point after the ascension, when the Gospels are written, Luke's Gospel is unique in that he is not someone of Jewish descent writing. And he states his purpose at the very beginning of his Gospel, because he's talking about it from the standpoint, or talking about what of Jesus's life, ministry, resurrection, birth, all of that from the standpoint that someone who is going through catechism. So in the early church, and those of you who grew up Catholic, you're probably more familiar with this than our Protestant brothers and sisters might be, unless you're Lutheran. Lutherans go through the catechism too. But basically, the catechism is a period of learning. So it used to be, although it doesn't say this to do this necessarily in the Bible, but it used to be that you couldn't get baptized at some point in the early church unless you had learned how to be a disciple of Jesus. And I get it. It makes sense. In our church, we believe that you can be baptized as a as soon as you believe, as a representation, as a declaration that you believe in the resurrection of Jesus, and that you want to follow him. But in some times during the long history of the church, the Christian church, it was required that you had to go through some classes first, and then you could be baptized. Anyway, so that's what Luke is saying in chapter 1. He says, many people, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation, he says, many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They used the eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write an accurate account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught. Okay, so who is Theophilus? I don't know. Nobody knows, really. We're guessing he's a guy. His name is Greek, so we're assuming that he is someone who maybe he was a God-fearer before, but he's not Jewish. He's not coming to this from an understanding of Judaism in the first century. He's not coming to this from the understanding of any context around what he believes and why he believes it, which is basically the rest of us, right? We're Theophilus. We are. We really are. We're walking around going, yeah, I don't know why they did the stuff that they did. I don't understand the animal sacrifices, and I don't understand some of the rules that they had. And honestly, it's because of our modern understanding now of some of the rules that are in the Old Testament that Jewish people would follow. It actually brings clarity to the whole nativity scene. Because here's the thing. There's no freaking way Mary would have given birth in a stable with animals present. It just is not. That's just not how they rolled. Like, that place was wiped clean. Not only that, but it wasn't a stable. It was an adjacent room to the home, the way they built homes back then in that part of the world, so that the animals could stay warm at night, or the warmth of the animals would help kind of heat or insulate the home. So basically what they did, there was no place to stay. And so Mary and Joseph were staying in all likelihood with relatives in Bethlehem. And the relatives were like, well, here's the thing. We're going to clean out the garage. It's not the best place, but we're going to scrub that place clean for you so that you have like some privacy here. It is also likely that they did not travel alone, but traveled with a group of relatives, and a midwife certainly would have been among them, considering the stage at which Mary was along in her pregnancy. So it is unlikely also that the animals were there, not only not there, but also that she had support and help, as one would assume. So the whole nativity scene. Anyway, I talk about that in another episode. So here's Theophilus. Theophilus is all of us, and he's like, what's going on? What happened? And Luke is saying, you know what? I'm going to write all this down for you, because I actually talked to Mary. I actually talked to some of the people. I witnessed some of it personally myself, and so I'm going to write all this down so that you have an accurate account. Because when the Gospels were written, we have 4 in our canon. However, there were dozens floating around. So when you're watching like the History Channel, for example, and the History Channel says, lost books of the Bible, and, it sounds all, ooh, they're keeping something from us. No, they're not really. It was decided by the 2nd century which books were like accurate and which ones weren't. And I often use this example. Many of you listening were alive during 9/11. Many of you listening definitely were alive during the pandemic. Many of you listening were definitely alive during COVID. So think about how major what are now historical events, and some of you were even alive when Martin Luther King was assassinated, or JFK or RFK, and how you look back on those events with your current knowledge, but also your lived experience of those events. And imagine the people who would have lived through the life and ministry and resurrection of Jesus and how they would have documented through an oral tradition or written those events as they understood them in the context they understood them in, and from their varying perspectives, whether they were someone who was socially, economically impoverished, someone who had lack of resources, someone who had many resources, someone who was Jewish, someone who was male, someone who was female, someone who was actually there, someone whose grandma was there, because by the time the Gospels were written, we're talking about 40, 50 years here, had gone by. And so you think about how, if you're talking to your grandpa or your parents about how they would have viewed the Vietnam War or how they viewed anything that happened, think about it. With everything going on in the world today, imagine how you were taught about Richard Nixon and his impeachment versus all the stuff that's happened in the last decade in our remembrance. It's a big difference. So I want you to kind of think about that. So these lost books of the Bible aren't really lost books. It was just like, yeah, that account wasn't really accurate, or that account wasn't theologically on target or helpful, or that's not going to make a difference in helping somebody really understand who Jesus is. So Luke continues, verse 5, it says, when Herod was king of Judea, there was a Jewish priest named Zechariah. He was a member of the priestly order of Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth was also from the priestly line of Aaron. Zechariah and Elizabeth were righteous in God's eyes, careful to obey all of the Lord's commandments and regulations. They had no children because Elizabeth was unable to conceive, and they were both very old. I'm going to pause there. You can read the rest of it on your own time. But what I was doing in preparation for speaking the other week, I listened to Luke's Gospel on the Bible app. And I had never paid attention. So when it got to this part and it was saying Elizabeth was from the priestly line of Aaron, and I was sitting there going, so what Luke is saying, if not for the fact of her gender, she probably would have been a priest too, because that's how it worked back then. If you were a boy and you were born in a priestly line, genealogical line, then you were in all likelihood going to grow up and be a priest. But if you were female, you married a priest, married somebody who was going to be a priest. I don't know if that detail is there, but I'm sitting there thinking, going, oh my goodness, this is a power couple. You've got Elizabeth and Zechariah, who both come from a line of priests. But here's the thing. The thing that's pointed out about Zechariah is he's from the priestly order of Abijah. Now, I don't know who Abijah is. I didn't look him up. You can and see what that is. But just kind of going off the cuff here, Luke points out that she's from the line of Aaron. That sounds like a bigger weight or more significant than where her husband's line comes from. So, yeah, they don't just throw stuff out there and not expect that the audience would get it or catch on or that it was significant. And so Luke is explaining things to Theophilus. And this is a big deal. But she's from Aaron's line. And that was something I had never caught before. And so I want you to go ahead. My message, the sermon that I shared was really about the Magnificat, because Mary's song of praise was something that I had not really studied before. And so I took the time to study that and look at how that made a difference in how we view the Advent season and how we anticipate the arrival of Jesus and what we know about Mary. And Mary, for those of you who are wondering, why do Catholics and some parts of Christianity put so much emphasis on her. Literally, they had a whole ecumenical council over Mary's status. And in the end, she is the God bearer. She's also a disciple of Jesus. And so her life is a great example of all of that, of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus and the Holy Spirit connecting with you. But she was Theotokos. She is the God bearer. She accepted God's call to bear the Messiah and participated in the early church community, as noted in Acts chapter 1. So here's the thing. I'm thinking, as I am recording today, when I tell you, you guys know this, I've got pages and pages and pages of notes. Where we're going today is I want to talk about a concept called theological anthropology. Theological anthropology. And the reason is because Mary, as the God bearer, and the Immaculate Conception, and when you think of the Nicene Creed and the whole idea of having to talk about her from the perspective of Jesus's divinity and how she, what role she plays in that. The reason that the Ecumenical Council 1,500 years ago came up with the idea of Theotokos, which is a Greek word for God-bearer, is simply because she's not divine, but she was someone the divine came through. And so was Elizabeth. And the fact that that Elizabeth comes from a priestly line, a family line, mattered enough that Luke included that detail, because he could have just said, Zechariah's wife Elizabeth. And usually when we hear this taught in our churches, we do kind of gloss over that. And that was why that was such an interesting detail to me, because it was something I hadn't really paid attention before. So I've quoted out of this book before from Beth Felker Jones, Practicing Christian Doctrine, an Introduction to Thinking and Living Theologically. In the second edition, chapter 5 is about theological anthropology. And what I have highlighted here is this, page 97. It says, when Christian theologians talk about human beings, we do so in terms of our relationship to God. The doctrine of the human being, the Christian teaching about what sort of creatures we are, is known as theological anthropology. Theological anthropology. Cultural anthropologists immerse themselves in cultures and societies in order to study habits, practices, and customs. Through joining people in eating, in worship, in sadness, and in celebration, anthropologists can provide a snapshot of the life of a small tribe in a rainforest, a unique church congregation, or even a group of college freshmen. A cultural anthropologist points out differences and similarities between cultures, helping us to know humanity better. The task of the theological anthropologist is different. Our job is to describe not a slice of humanity, but all of it, and to do so in light of humanity's relationship with God. Theological anthropology seeks to understand humanity both as God intends it to be and as it actually is, and the two are often very different. The two are often very different. And we take it seriously because God takes it seriously. It matters. So the shape of Jesus's life challenges our understanding of our own lives, undermining our self-absorption and our presumptions about what our lives mean. In showing us true humanity, Jesus Christ alone enables us to practice being human. Because in Genesis, God said, as creation is good, so humanity is very good. We got the very good until we screwed it up. So the thing that Dr. Jones continues writing here is our created finitude means that we need one another, that we receive the gift of learning to live with and for one another, and above all, that we need God. So what are the key aspects of theological anthropology? that we find in Luke chapter 1. We're talking about Mary and Elizabeth, because in the context of Mary and Elizabeth's miracle birth stories in Luke's gospel, theological anthropology comes into focus as the narratives reveal the truth about human identity, purpose, and our relationship with God. I think that Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, in its veneration of Mary, they were kind of on the right track in that, like, holding her up to say, hey, she was a great example of being obedient to God, and Elizabeth too. But the thing that we miss is that the focus is on the wrong person. The focus should be on Jesus. And so from a theology standpoint, if we take a step back and we look at what's really going on with this unexpected announcement and how she was able to, how both women navigate fear and doubt. Because Zechariah has fear and doubt immediately, and the angel zips his mouth shut for the next several months. Like, he doesn't speak again until John's born. But his wife, Elizabeth, has faith. And she's like, no, we're going to roll with this. And I believe this is what we're supposed to be doing. Like, she embraces this moment in her life. And Mary, the same thing. I saw a post, actually, I shared it, that reiterated something I've shared before. If it's about male headship, if this was really a theological thing that God was trying to implement or condone, or teach in the New Testament under the new covenant, then we would have had Joseph or Mary's father in positions of authority in saying yes or no, as opposed to Mary's agency and being able to say yes or no to God. And we see that Mary chooses to say yes. And I think that allows her, or is it is showing us that she has clarity of purpose and clarity of identity. And we've talked about that on the podcast. Like, from a discipleship standpoint, if we're modeling ourselves after Elizabeth, after Mary, then we're looking at a clarity of purpose, a clarity of identity. And that's what theological anthropology does. It's the study of humanity from a theological perspective, focusing on the questions about human nature and purpose and destiny in relationship to God. And examines how humans are created in the image of God, the Imago Dei, their role within creation, our relationship with God, and how sin and redemption shape our identity and our purpose. And that's what we see for Mary. And so what are the key aspects of theological anthropology in Luke 1? Well, one is human participation in divine purposes. Both Mary and Elizabeth are depicted as integral to God's redemptive plan. And while they may have experienced social marginalization because, Elizabeth, because of her old age and barrenness, like that was frowned upon, right? And Mary, due to her youth and low status, or the perception that we have that she had low status, they're chosen by God to bear children who will play pivotal roles in salvation's history. Like, the whole thing about Jesus coming in to God breaking into history, into human history, going, all right, here I am, I'm coming to fix things. They're chosen by God to bear children who will play pivotal roles in the history of salvation. So yes, we know about them. Although I would add that we probably don't know enough about them. And so all of that comes into focus, right? That comes into focus. And so it highlights the theological truth that human dignity and purpose are defined not by society standards, but by divine calling. Number 2 is embodiment in the image of God. The physicality of pregnancy in these stories underscores the idea that human bodies are central to God's purposes. Remember, God created the first human out of the dust of the ground. He creates the second human out of that first human and then tells them, you guys connect again so that you can make more humans. And that's what they do. This embodiment and the image of God, the physicalness, the physicality of pregnancy. Elizabeth and Mary's pregnancies affirm the goodness of creation, the very goodness of creation, and the sacredness of human life, emphasizing that God works through embodied human experiences to bring about divine will. And then there's number 3, faith as a component of human identity. The responses of Mary and Elizabeth illustrate the anthropological significance of faith. Mary's declaration, I am the Lord's servant, in Luke chapter 1, verse 38, and Elizabeth's recognition of God's work in Mary show how faith aligns humanity with God's purposes, and their trust and their obedience reflect an ideal human response to God's narrative. Now, I've got a total of 6 things here, so keep rocking with me, okay? Number 4, community and mutual support. I talked about this in my message from the standpoint of one of the tenets or one of the key things in our church is, we talk about finding God, finding community is number 2, discovering your purpose and then making a difference. And there's lots of churches that have, something along those lines similar, but community is a huge deal. So from a discipleship standpoint, if you are helping somebody at this point, and especially if you've been listening to this podcast for the last 4 years, you should be at the point now where you have reconstructed your faith and you are helping somebody else deconstruct and reconstruct. This is how that's supposed to work. And it's done in community and with mutual support. So what do we have shown here in front of us? Well, the interaction between Mary and Elizabeth demonstrates the importance of community in human flourishing. Elizabeth's joyous welcome of Mary reflects a theological anthropology that values relationships as a means of affirming divine work in each other's lives. Like, you have to have people that you can go to. It says in the text that Mary immediately was like, I'm going to go talk to my cousin Elizabeth. Why Elizabeth? Why not somebody who lived closer? Like, literally, she's like, okay, it is entirely possible at this point that Mary is aware that Elizabeth is mysteriously, suddenly pregnant. This is her cousin, it says in the text. Luke points that out. And so she goes immediately to go visit this cousin. She demonstrates community and mutual support with the two of them, not just from the Holy Spirit bouncing back and forth between their two bellies, but affirming one another that, hey, I support what's going on with you. I affirm it because this is what's going on with me. Do you have friends that you can do that with? If not, then you probably need to join a local church so that you can build that community around you. That humanity is designed for connection and encouragement. God says in Genesis, it's not good for humans to be alone. It's not that we all need to be hooked up with a boo. It's we just need to be connected with each other. And yes, some of those connections require procreation. So yeah, you do need a husband or a wife or all that. But the point was community and support. Number 5, the role of women. You knew I was going to get to that. By the way, as you're shopping this holiday season, a great resource for you to purchase would be my book, The Women Who Follow Jesus, that Bible study. Or if you've got someone with kids and you want little girls and boys to know about the women who follow Jesus, I've got the coloring book too. All of that is available on Amazon. Just search for me, Erica Santiago, on Amazon, and you can find those books. So the role of women, number 5, in God's economy. In Luke's gospel, Mary and Elizabeth challenged the cultural norms by being central figures in God's salvific work. What does that mean? Talking about the story of salvation, the history of salvation, we are talking about these two women more than 2,000 years after they lived. Luke is talking about them probably 40 or 50 years after the fact, from his interviews and conversations in real time with, I want to understand better what we've been taught and to explain the incarnation and really get at the root of who John the Baptist and who Jesus are. You need to understand where they came from. And so we have these two women whose stories mattered enough to be recorded in this gospel and continued to matter enough that Luke's gospel made it into the canon of Scripture. And so this elevates the theological understanding of gender, showing that both women and men equally bear the image of God and are crucial participants in God's plans. This is important. And number 6, God's power in human weakness. One of the things that I love about Pete Scazzaro's book on discipleship is he has a whole chapter on understanding our limitations. Understanding our limitations. We're not, as humans, we're not God. That was the problem in Genesis. That was the problem with Adam and Eve trying to be a little bit too much like God, and that got them in trouble. And every time we have that, in fact, and I'll have to talk about it another time, but total side note, comparing Genesis 11, I think I may have even put together a blog post and put it on the Patreon page. I can't remember. Last week feels so far away already. And it's only December 8th as I'm recording. God's power and human weakness, the idea of we have limitations as humans. And in the garden, based on my studies, I would say that it seems like Adam and Eve probably could have lived forever. I mean, think about how people lived at that time. So here's my side note, though, about this. By the time we get to Genesis chapter 11 and the Tower of Babel, you've got people, once again, trying to get to God and be God and reach God. Notice, though, how Acts chapter 2, Pentecost, reverses what happens in Genesis 11. And then notice also in Revelation, the great choir that's singing Holy, Holy, Holy is made up of every nation and every tongue, speaking again in unison, empowered by the Holy Spirit. Just side note, I wrote something, it's on the Patreon page. Maybe we'll talk about it a little bit more on a future episode. But I just want to point that out as we talk about number 6, God's power in human weakness. Both miracle births highlight that God often chooses those perceived as weak or incapable to accomplish divine purposes. Elizabeth's barrenness, her infertility, to use a more modern word, and Mary's virginity underscore the truth that human limitations do not hinder God's power, reinforcing a theological anthropology that finds strength in dependence on God. Now, let me circle back again with the whole virginity thing, because I think I addressed it in a previous Christmas episode here on No More Silos. In our context today, 2024, we hear virgin, we hear, they had not participated or engaged in the activities that would normally involve sex. So there's that. But there's also the language of the time. Calling somebody a virgin may have just been a allusion to their youth, to their not having been married, not saying that that Mary was not a virgin. I'm just saying that if someone, I look at it like this, if someone is going to lose their Jesus over the virgin birth because there's other cultures and religious contexts with other religions where they talk about their divine person in the context of them having been born of a virgin, I want you to understand there's a bigger historical context that is happening there by saying that. This is like and he was born of a virgin. People in that time would have understood this. We look at it and we're very black and white over it. And so I don't want you to get stuck on it. If somebody gives you pushback as you are helping them reconstruct their faith about the virgin birth, be like, okay, yeah, whatever. If it's maybe virgin and she's just young, that's what they were calling her. That was the word that would have been used in the language of that time. Don't get stuck there. What matters is that Jesus resurrected from the dead. There were eyewitnesses, and there's historical evidence that there were eyewitnesses of people who followed this man around and then believed in that time. There's contemporary corroboration historically that in that time there were people who believed they saw him after he was killed. That you want to hang your hat on. The virgin birth, that's not the hill you want to die on. Even at Christmas time, not the hill you want to die on. Because what matters more is that she wasn't married. That's what matters more. And so what are the implications for theological anthropology? That we as humans are instruments of God's grace. That there's a universality of divine calling. In other words, it's what Paul writes in Galatians: neither slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, we are all part of God's family. We are all equal in God's sight. We are all active participants. And so talking about Mary and Elizabeth affirms that human beings are not passive in God's plans, but are active participants and empowered by God's grace and the Holy Spirit. That his calling extends to all of us, regardless of our age, of our gender, our social status. And so it challenges the hierarchical views of human worth. I mean, Elizabeth's husband demonstrates a lack of faith, and he's literally like mute for the next several months. Like, yeah, you keep quiet. We're going to put you on mute. Literally. And then the hope of Christmas, the hope of transformation. The miraculous births point to God's ability to transform despair, to transform uncertainty into joy and hope, emphasizing that our existence as humans is open to divine renewal. Like, this is a big deal. Here you have a woman who has probably been ostracized or talked bad about because she's infertile. And then you have Mary's response, like, I know I'm not married yet, and this guy that I'm engaged to is probably going to freak out, but I'm not going to worry about that because my identity understands that the Messiah was coming, and if he's coming through me, I'm down for whatever. So you have this transformation even in this moment. Luke opens up with this transformation. And so he enriches our theological anthropology by illustrating that human identity and purpose are deeply rooted in divine calling and faith and relationality. And these narratives of these two women, at this point, very short for Elizabeth, and we don't really hear much else about her after this, except she raises John the Baptist, right? And then you've got Mary, who we see where her story lands and different points throughout the process. We read more in Matthew's gospel about her. But these narratives highlight the dignity of everyone, really, as bearers of God's image, and affirm the transformative potential of human participation in God's redemptive work. Because here's that redemptive story, that's where that kicks off. Now, when we circle back the next time in our next Christmas-themed episode, I want to talk to you a little bit about how all of this ties in with Dr. Anita Phillips' book, The Garden Within, which emphasizes the integration of faith into every aspect of one's being, your mind, your body, and your spirit, encouraging readers to live an embodied faith. And theological anthropology provides the foundational framework for understanding this concept by affirming that human beings, us, as created in the image of God, are holistic creatures. And her perspective values the physical, emotional, and spiritual dimensions of human life, seeing them as interconnected and integral to our expressions of faith. And in this holiday season, I want us to think about how Emmanuel, God with us, remains not just a historical truth, but a present reality. And let's live as people who carry this presence out into the world as we help our friends and loved ones reconstruct their faith after deconstructing. Thanks for listening to No More Silos this week. Thank you for your continued support. Visit us on Patreon at No More Silos. Check out the resources that are there, but also follow us on social media at Cultural Christianity, and check us out there. And I just learned that it looks like TikTok is going away. Maybe. I don't know. We'll see. But I'm on TikTok at Dr. Erica Santiago. So have a great rest of your day. And I will be back very soon to talk about embodied faith. Thanks and have a great rest of your day.